Picture a moment when everything you have ever trusted is suddenly shattered, when the very foundation on which you built your dreams, hopes, and legacies crumbles into innumerable fragments as if splintered glass scattered before your eyes. In that fleeting instant, time seems to slow, and the weight of betrayal is felt in every fiber of your being. This is not a mere introduction, it is the moment when fate intervenes, when a single revelation transforms an ordinary day into a turning point that will forever change your life. Imagine, if you will, the intimate hush that falls over a room filled with cherished memories, a space once resonating with laughter, warmth, and the promise of shared tomorrows, now suddenly echoing with the cold silence of deception. In that instant of overwhelming realization, you come face to face with a truth so staggering, it defies explanation. I stand before you today to unburden my soul and share a testimony of a betrayal so deep and calculated that it shook the very pillars of my family's honor. For in the heart of the story lies a legacy, a sacred college fund that had been nurtured over generations, assembled with the sweat of hard work, the tears of sacrifice, and an unyielding commitment to a better future. That fund, which came to embody $800,000 of hope and promise, was established not for mundane financial gain but to secure the educational dreams and aspirations of our beloved family. Yet, in a twist of fate almost too painful to contemplate, the person least expected, a trusted sister-in-law, set in motion events designed to divert this treasured inheritance for her personal gain. Even as these words echo in your mind, recall the ancient promise, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." The scripture, timeless and unyielding, offers solace even in the bitter wake of deception. It is a beacon that shines in the darkest of times, a reminder that even when trust is shattered, faith remains a steadfast guide toward redemption. In these very first seconds, as you listen intently to my voice, know that you are embarking on a journey, a 2-hour odyssey through the labyrinth of betrayal, the arduous process of uncovering wrongful deeds, and ultimately the triumphant pursuit of justice and restoration. Every word spoken here is not mere rhetoric, but a solemn commitment to reveal the painful truth behind how a family's legacy was imperiled. Every syllable, every pause, is meant to pull you deeper into a narrative where the stakes are nothing less than the honor that has been amassed over decades. Now, imagine that the very air around you trembles with anticipation, as if eager to witness the unveiling of secrets hidden behind seemingly innocent smiles. Picture those first fleeting seconds as a microcosm of the unfolding drama, a drama where loyalty is tested beyond measure and where the casual infusion of hope is swiftly transformed into the realization that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places. This introduction is not a mere spark, but the blazing ignition of a story brimming with raw emotion, heartbreak, and an unwavering determination to reclaim what has been stolen. As your attention is captured by these opening words, let your heart be stirred by the promise of revelation. In the next moments, you will be drawn into a narrative that is as intimate as it is explosive. Prepare yourself for a journey that will force you to confront the fragility of trust and the paradoxical strength that emerges when one stands up against betrayal. Here, in the quiet of these first precious seconds, every ounce of hope is kindled anew, and every call for righteousness reverberates with the intensity of a soul determined to reclaim its destiny. Dear listener, to a story where every shattered piece of trust tells a tale of resilience, where every whisper of deceit ultimately gives way to a roar of justice. Allow the journey to begin, not with an apology for the pain it may bring, but with a vow to transform every heartbreak into a catalyst for redemption, for it is only through the crucible of betrayal that the purest truths can emerge. As I take you back to the early chapters of my life, long before the storm of betrayal darkened our family's doorstep, let me paint a portrait of a time filled with hope, love, and unwavering commitment. I was born into a family where every laugh shared, every meal gathered around the dining table, was a celebration of unity and mutual respect. In our home, the spoken word carried weight, and the lessons of integrity were passed down like cherished heirlooms. My earliest memories are steeped in the warmth of evenings spent with my grandparents, whose stories of perseverance and sacrifice resonated deeply as they recounted the humble beginnings of our esteemed college fund, a financial emblem crafted through countless hours of hard labor, heartfelt dreams, and the collective sacrifices of an entire generation. This fund, which eventually amounted to $800,000, was much more than a mere sum of money. It was the lifeblood of our family's future. Every deposit was a quiet affirmation of our hopes, every withdrawal a reason to celebrate a milestone in life. It was established not only to provide for an education but to serve as a symbol of our commitment to carrying forward the torch of legacy, a torch lit by the hands of those who came before us. I remember the soft murmur of conversation in the parlor as my grandparents, with eyes radiant with pride, would describe how every coin saved, every dollar earned, was imbued with purpose. They taught me that the strength of our values was measured not in wealth alone, but in the courage to uphold our principles against the winds of adversity. Those were days filled with sugar-sweet memories, the clinking of cutlery on porcelain, the aroma of home-cooked meals wafting through the halls, and the quiet confidences that were exchanged during long-forgotten conversations. Even the simplest moments, a walk in the fading light of a summer evening, or the quiet compulsion in a gentle word spoken between kin, felt imbued with significance. Each passing day was a tapestry woven with devotion, a living testament to an unbroken line of trust that spanned decades. The college fund, cherished and meticulously guarded, represented the very embodiment of these values. Shadows of worry were unknown then, for the air was filled with promises of unyielding faith and a collective commitment to nourish both the mind and the soul. Yet, even as I reveled in these recollections, there were early echoes of disquiet that would later reveal themselves as forewarnings of betrayal. At first, they appeared as but a fleeting nuance, a hesitation in a well-rehearsed conversation, a minute alteration in a ledger's entry that would have been easily overlooked. I recall sitting by the fireplace on crisp autumn evenings, eyes fixed on the dancing flames as I pored over fragile documents that chronicled our family's journey. In those moments of quiet contemplation, every detail of our financial records held a sacred quality, a silent promise of reliability and hope. And yet, amidst the benign assurances lay subtle indicators that something was amiss, slight discrepancies here, an ink smudge there, which in retrospect pointed to a disquieting truth. As I grew older, my understanding of the true value of our college fund deepened. It was more than numbers on a page, it was a repository of our collective history, our dreams for the future meticulously planted in fertile ground by the labors of our forebears. I learned early on that with great heritage comes great responsibility not only to cherish what was passed down but to protect it with every fiber of one's being. Thus, in the quiet of my study, illuminated by the comforting glow of a vintage lamp, I began to internalize the notion that safeguarding this legacy was a sacred duty. Every page of those weathered documents beckoned me to understand their story, each word a reminder of the promise that had once set our hearts aflame with hope. It was in that hallowed space of reflective solitude that the seeds of my destiny were sown. I was no longer a passive recipient of inherited values, but a vigilant guardian determined to uphold the honor of a heritage that was measured in both sacrifice and love. I cherished each lesson whispered in the soft cadence of my grandmother's voice, each recounting of trials overcome and victories earned. The weight of responsibility settled upon my young shoulders as naturally as the twilight itself, infusing my very being with a sense of purpose that transcended ordinary ambition. And yet, as every narrative has its crest, so too did mine harbor the first, almost imperceptible stirrings of an impending storm. There were moments during joyous family celebrations when, despite the laughter and camaraderie, I sensed a pallid undercurrent, a whisper of dissonance that belied the outward harmony of our lives. It was as though the ledger itself, meticulously maintained over the years, began to murmur secrets in a language of irregularities and minor deviations. Those early signs were faint, almost lost amidst the warmth of our shared experiences, yet they planted within me a cautious seed of inquiry, a drive to delve deeper and ensure that the sanctity of our legacy remained unblemished. In the sacred glow of memory and responsibility, I came to understand that protecting the treasure of our heritage was as crucial as nurturing the bonds of familial love. The college fund, which represented $800,000 of hope, was not solely a measure of fiscal security, it was an emblem of our core values and the vibrant spirit that sustained us. This realization, born out of the confluence of nostalgia and burgeoning vigilance, would eventually set me on a path fraught with tough decisions and heart-wrenching revelations. Yet, even as those first hints of unease began to take shape, I could not have imagined the magnitude of the storm that was to come, a storm that would test every ounce of my resolve, every lesson I had ever learned about trust and integrity. Thus, in that unfolding era of innocence and emerging responsibility, I silently vowed that not a single fragment of that luminous legacy would be allowed to fade into oblivion. I would stand as the sentinel of our family's honor, cherishing the past and defending the promise of the future. And so, as I invite you now to journey deeper into this story, a story woven with threads of triumph and treachery, of steadfast devotion and shattering betrayal, remember that every cherished memory, every long-cherished hope encapsulated in those ancient records, is a beacon calling us to preserve the sacred flame of our heritage. As the minutes passed and life's comforting rhythms continued unchecked, an imperceptible change began to take root, one that would slowly unravel the fabric of trust we held so dear. It started on an otherwise unremarkable evening, when the golden hues of a setting sun filtered through the old study's window and I, in the timeless solitude of my reading nook, resolved to revisit the family registers and financial records with a renewed sense of diligence. In the soft quiet of night, with the gentle hum of the ticking clock as my only companion, I spread before me stacks of handwritten ledgers, brittle with age yet rich with the history of sacrifices made and dreams nurtured. Each record, carefully maintained and passed down like a precious relic, recounted the painstaking journey of our college fund, a treasure that had, over time, grown to embody $800,000 of hopes, dreams, and collective labor. With a sense both of duty and trepidation, I began to examine these documents with a discerning eye, fully aware that even the smallest error might reveal a darker truth. At first glance, the entries appeared immaculate, meticulous notations of deposits and withdrawals, detailed accounts of every household contribution. But as the night deepened and my concentration sharpened, tiny irregularities began to emerge. There were slight deviations in the handwriting, entries where the spacing between numbers was oddly inconsistent, and corrections made with an uncharacteristic haste that suggested a hidden agenda. Each anomaly, though seemingly trivial on its own, gradually coalesced into a pattern that could not be explained away as mere human error. I recall one particularly silent night when the world outside was hushed by a gentle autumn rain. There, in the protective cocoon of the study, I meticulously compared multiple ledgers that chronicled years of unerring trust. With every careful stroke of my pen, noting the exact dates and obscure details of each discrepancy, I felt a mounting sense of disquiet. It was as if the pages themselves were whispering secrets, a clandestine narrative of betrayal embedded within the folds of the ink and paper. The realization dawned upon me slowly: the very foundation of our legacy, the sacred college fund entrusted with $800,000 of legacy and hope, was now in peril. Every minute detail was scrutinized. I catalogued what might have once been dismissed as mere typos now bearing the hallmark of deliberate misrepresentation. A signature that seemed out of place. A correction in the margin that did not mimic the familiar scrawl of my father or grandfather. A figure altered ever so slightly in a ledger that once had been unassailable. Each discovery was documented in a separate notebook, every irregularity recorded in painstaking detail. I began to cross-reference these findings with older, more trustworthy records that had been safeguarded in a locked drawer, and the evidence, like a tapestry of silent mutiny, began to unfurl before my eyes. The process of investigation was both methodical and profoundly isolating. Nights turned into early mornings as I pored over document after document, each page a potential clue pointing to a conspiracy that had been carefully hidden from our collective awareness. Shadows lengthened in the room, and the steady, almost hypnotic scratching of my pen on paper marked the passage of time as my inner turmoil grew. I found solace in a whispered prayer, recalling the comforting words, "Wait on the Lord, be of good courage," which offered a sliver of reassurance amidst the swirling uncertainty. Yet, as the evidence mounted, so too did a quiet dread settle into my bones. I could no longer dismiss the irregularities as benign mistakes; they had evolved into a coherent, damning pattern. The numbers that once danced confidently on those ledgers now told a tale of surreptitious tampering and misdirected trust. I began to suspect that someone had deliberately altered the financial records. There was an art to the manipulation, a calculated precision that betrayed a planner, a schemer who knew intimately the inner workings of our family's most treasured financial reserve. It wasn't long before subtle rumors at family gatherings started to mirror my growing suspicions. In the midst of light-hearted conversations, fleeting glances and muted exchanges hinted at a clandestine awareness of something amiss. I listened in on whispers that were meant to be private, and every offhand remark, every hint of unease expressed in a hushed tone, lent credence to my painstaking discoveries. It became painfully clear that the trust we had all once taken for granted was under siege, manipulated quietly behind closed doors. Navigating this labyrinth of revelations was agonizingly slow, yet every moment spent recording these irregularities steeled my resolve. I was no longer the innocent beneficiary of a lovingly maintained legacy. I had become the reluctant guardian of a truth that was steadily emerging from the shadows. Every ripple in the financial records, every minuscule misalignment of numbers, was a thread in the intricate tapestry of betrayal that now threatened to unravel the very fabric of our family's future. In those long, sleepless nights, I replayed comforting words from the scriptures, allowing the verse, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness," to echo in the silent corridors of my heart. This divine reminder was not just a call to maintain my faith, it was a rallying cry to pursue the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried beneath layers of careful deceit. With each tick of the clock, the mounting evidence whispered louder, urging me to act before it was too late. Thus, as the investigation entered a new phase, each page of the ancient ledgers and every meticulously noted anomaly became a stepping stone toward a confrontation that I knew was inevitable. The quiet night gave way to the first light of dawn as the weight of discovery pressed upon me, signaling that no amount of reverence for the past could shield us from the insidious corruption that now threatened to destroy a legacy worth $800,000. I resolved, in that luminous moment of clarity, to uncover the full extent of this treachery, even if it meant confronting the painful reality that someone I had dearly trusted had undermined the very principles upon which our family was built. As the days turned into weeks and my initial quiet suspicions evolved into an all-consuming quest for truth, the environment around me began to change in ways I could scarcely have predicted. The once tranquil ambience of my home grew heavy with tension, and every familiar corner of our ancestral estate seemed imbued with a foreboding sense of loss. What had begun as a series of isolated, seemingly innocuous irregularities in our cherished ledgers now coalesced into a damning mural of deceit, a picture that could no longer be ignored. Night after night, under the solitary glow of my desk lamp, I immersed myself in the painstaking process of re-examining every document with a magnifying glass of suspicion. I revisited each financial record with an intensity born not of paranoia alone but of a deep-seated conviction that something sacred was at risk. Lay open on my desk were piles of battered notebooks, each one dedicated to cataloging deviations, every misprinted number, every unfamiliar flourish, every hasty correction that stood as a silent testimony to clandestine tampering. I began to document these findings in detail, the specific dates when discrepancies first appeared, cross-referenced entries that seemed to contradict one another, and even the subtle differences in ink and handwriting that betrayed a deliberate effort to manipulate our sacred numbers. This process of systematic investigation took on the fervor of an obsession. I charted every anomaly on a sprawling timeline, mapping out the trajectory of these errors as if piecing together a coded message. The more I delved into the pages of our financial history, the more the true scale of the betrayal emerged. There were distinct patterns, a certain period when the discrepancies were more frequent, an unusual synchronization of alterations that suggested coordination between dates and amounts. It was as though someone with intimate knowledge of our family's inner workings had set up an intricate dance of deception, choreographing a slow siphon of funds from our treasured college reserve, which represented $800,000 in hope and legacy. The gathering of evidence soon extended beyond the ink-stained pages of old ledgers. I began to embrace modern tools, scanning and digitizing every document, using software to detect minute changes in text and formatting, and comparing these digital records with their original printed counterparts. This blend of traditional scrutiny and technological analysis enriched my findings, and with every piece of corroborated evidence, the architecture of betrayal grew impossibly clear. Even inconspicuous emails, once dismissed as routine correspondence, now revealed themselves to be integral parts of a larger puzzle, hinting at internal communications that suggested foreknowledge of the anomalies. In the midst of these exhaustive investigations, the emotional toll grew heavy. There were moments when the sheer magnitude of the deception overwhelmed me, moments when the memories of childhood hope seemed tainted by the bitter sting of treachery. Yet, in these very moments of despair, the words, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good," rang out like a lifeline from deep within my soul. This eternal verse fortified my resolve, transforming my pain into a burning determination to unearth the truth, no matter how deeply it was concealed behind layers of meticulous subterfuge. The search for answers was not a solitary endeavor. Quiet confidences and furtive discussions began to surface in the context of our family's gatherings. Trusted relatives, initially impassive in the face of my early findings, gradually began to murmur their own observations. In hushed tones and sidelong glances exchanged across candlelit tables, fragments of concern crept into our conversations. The realization dawned that, collectively, we were facing a crisis that transcended individual blame and threatened the very integrity of our shared future. Each clandestine conversation, laden with veiled accusations and unspoken apprehensions, added to the weight of the evidence I was amassing. Every scrap of data, from the smallest misalignment of figures in a ledger to the most minute digital timestamp on an email, was unearthed through painstaking attention to detail. I meticulously compiled photographs of every scanned document, annotated the irregularities with relentless precision, and organized them into an extensive portfolio that chronicled the steady erosion of trust from within. The evidence was no longer a whisper of isolated incidents, it had evolved into an unassailable narrative of betrayal that could be laid out for all to see. The environment around me transformed as well. The once comforting silence of my study was replaced by an incessant clamor of obsessive scrutiny. I could almost hear the echoes of my pen scribbling notes late into the night, the rustle of paper aligning like pieces of a complex puzzle under the unwavering gaze of an unyielding investigator. Every detail was a brushstroke in a grand portrait of deceit, a portrait that depicted every stolen dollar, every meticulously altered number in our sacred $800,000 college fund. As midnight gave way to the pre-dawn hues of hope, I realized that the document of betrayal I was compiling would serve not merely as evidence, but as a summation of my unwavering dedication to preserving what was most sacred to us. With each documented irregularity, I felt the tightening of resolve in my chest, a promise that I would challenge the forces that dared to undermine our legacy. The systematic collection of evidence had now become a battle cry, a declaration that the truth, no matter how long buried, would eventually rise to the surface. By the time the first rays of morning light began to filter through the dusty curtains, my collection of evidence had grown into a formidable archive, a silent testimony to a deliberate and calculated campaign of deception. The realization was as bitter as it was inevitable. The foundation of our legacy, the one that had sheltered $800,000 of hope and dreams, was under siege by a force most unthinkable. And so, with a heavy heart yet a spirit unbroken, I prepared myself for the next phase of this inexorable journey, one where every carefully catalogued detail would propel us toward the long-awaited confrontation. As the relentless tide of evidence refused to be quelled, the inevitable moment of confrontation loomed on the horizon, heavy with the promises of redemption and retribution. The atmosphere within our family's gathering place, once a haven of warmth and shared joy, had transformed into a crucible of tension, where every heartbeat reverberated with the promise of an impending reckoning. The accumulated evidence, a painstaking chronicle of deceit and betrayal, now demanded an answer. It was time to unveil the hidden face of treachery before every family member and confront the individual responsible for this unimaginable breach of trust. I summoned the courage to arrange a family meeting in the old living room, the very space that had once echoed with the merry laughter of reunions, now an arena for the confrontation of unspeakable guilt. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across familiar furnishings, each member of our family took their place, their eyes filled with a mixture of anticipation, disbelief, and sorrow. It was as if even the air itself held its breath in solemn expectation of what was about to unfold. With the evidence spread out meticulously before me, pages upon pages of recorded discrepancies, annotated dates, and corroborated digital traces, I stood before the assembled crowd, my voice steady yet laden with the weight of every shattered dream. I began by recounting the journey that had led to this moment, outlining, with painstaking precision, the gradual accumulation of evidence that had exposed a pattern of deliberate misappropriation. I detailed how every erroneous entry, every faint alteration in the revered ledgers, wove together into a tapestry of betrayal that now implicated none other than the one person we had all trusted implicitly. The silence in the room grew almost oppressive as I read aloud each finding, pausing to let the gravity of every fact sink in. Then, in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, all eyes turned toward my sister-in-law. Her face, once warm and familiar, now bore the pallor of mounting guilt. The room was charged with an electric intensity as I demanded, in a voice that trembled between sorrow and righteous anger, an explanation for the calculated deviations that had eroded the sanctity of our $800,000 legacy. How could you, I demanded, my voice rising above the quiet murmurs of the onlookers, betray the very trust that held our family together? How could you intentionally tamper with records that were the foundation of our future, our shared dreams? The words hung in the air, a silken noose that tightened with every second of silence that followed. The evidence, laid out in front of us all, was irrefutable. Every page, every digital timestamp, narrated the harrowing story of a betrayal so deep that it threatened to dismantle the very structure of our familial bonds. For a long, agonizing pause, no one spoke. Then, a tremor passed through the room, a subtle shuffling, a collective intake of breath, as my sister-in-law attempted to meet my gaze. The accusation had struck at the heart of her carefully hidden secrets. Her eyes, wide with a mix of panic and defiance, betrayed the internal turmoil raging within her. She opened her mouth to speak, but the sheer weight of the incontrovertible evidence rendered every excuse meaningless. Her attempted defenses stumbled over themselves as the meticulously documented anomalies were recounted one by one, the altered figures, the hesitantly corrected entries, the intimate details that no one but someone with insider knowledge could have surreptitiously amended. Every soul in that room bore witness, not merely to an act of financial misdeed, but to a violation of sacred trust. As one of the older relatives, with tears glistening in weathered eyes, murmured softly, "Our legacy, built with so much sacrifice, cannot endure such deceit," the atmosphere grew heavier still. Even as emotions ran high and voices trembled, I continued, my tone transforming from raw indignation to a resolute call for justice. I invoked a verse that had accompanied me through my darkest moments: "The righteous shall live by faith." These words, steeped in timeless wisdom, rang out as both a condemnation of the betrayal and a beacon of hope for the future. We not, and we will not, I declared firmly, allow this disgrace to stand unchallenged. We must reclaim our integrity, restore what has been desecrated, and rebuild the legacy that was entrusted to us with so much care. Every single word became a rallying cry, reverberating in the hearts of everyone present. The confrontation had reached its apex, an explosive moment where hidden truths were laid bare, and the silence was no longer an option. In that intensely charged atmosphere, the perpetrator's defenses crumbled under the relentless force of proof and the collective resolve of a family determined to fight for its honor. As the tension peaked and the siblings, parents, and elders exchanged looks of sorrow and surprise, the moment of reckoning transformed into a solemn vow that this betrayal, though it had scarred our history, would not overshadow the promise of a brighter future. With a final, impassioned declaration, I vowed, "Today, we stand united against treachery." Our $800,000 legacy, a symbol of our shared dreams and sacrifices, shall be defended at all costs. The truth will prevail. In those heart-wrenching moments, the confrontation was more than a personal dispute, it became a turning point that would define our family's future. The raw emotion, the collective pain, and the fierce determination radiated from every corner of the room, setting the stage for the long, hard journey toward healing, justice, and ultimately, redemption. In the wake of that heart-wrenching confrontation, when the painful truth was laid open to all, and the raw wounds of betrayal were as vivid as scars upon our souls, the path toward healing required more than familial admonishment. It demanded the unwavering authority of justice, administered through the channels of the legal system. With the weight of incontrovertible evidence in hand, a new chapter began, a chapter defined by the systematic pursuit of vindication and the solemn duty to restore our family's honor. Immediately following the explosive meeting, I set forth to compile every shred of evidence into an organized legal portfolio that could withstand the scrutiny of even the most rigorous judicial examination. Every meticulously annotated page was reprinted, digitized, and arranged chronologically, a testament to the deliberate, systematic corruption that had ensnared our cherished college fund. This was not simply paper and ink, it was the collective history of countless sacrificed hours and shared hopes, embodied in documents that now bore silent witness to a betrayal so calculated that it shook the very foundation of our trust. Determined to see justice done, I sought counsel from seasoned attorneys renowned for their fierce defense of integrity and the underdog. With each meeting in dimly lit conference rooms and each consultation in somber law offices, the gravity of the situation only grew. Discussions were long, detailed, and marked by an unwavering focus on truth. Every objection raised by those who would defend the miscreant was countered with the cold, hard facts, the very facts that I had spent sleepless nights laboring over. The courtroom soon became the stage upon which this drama unfolded, a stark arena where evidentiary exhibits were paraded before a jury, where every digital record, every handwritten ledger, spoke with the clarity of undeniable truth. I remember vividly the measured cadence of legal arguments, the formal pronouncements of the judge, and the collective murmur of an audience that sensed they were witnessing a pivotal moment in the quest for justice. With every witness testimony that corroborated my painstaking investigations, the narrative of betrayal was reinforced like the steady beat of a drum pounding for accountability. One by one, trusted family members and expert witnesses took the stand. Their voices, laden with regret and sorrow as they recounted the silent anomalies they had observed over the years, lent gravity to the proceedings. Their testimonies painted a picture of a deeply orchestrated deceit, each statement reinforcing the meticulously documented trail of irregularities that spanned years and had systematically undermined our family's legacy. Every question pressed, every cross-examination delivered with clinical precision, chipped away at the defenses of those who had sought to hide behind guise and pretense. During these long sessions in the courtroom, I found solace in the reassuring echoes of Scripture, quietly reciting, "For the Lord loves justice and will not forsake his saints." These words were not only a source of personal comfort but a clarion call to the moral ethos that had guided my every step from the day I first discovered the discrepancies in our hallowed records. As hours turned into days in the judicial arena, the relentless pursuit of veracity gradually began to tip the scales of justice in our favor. The defendants, once shrouded in the comfort of familial trust, found themselves ensnared in a web of irrefutable evidence, their excuses rendered hollow by the chain of meticulously gathered documents and witness accounts. The courtroom, once cold and indifferent, transformed into a crucible where the truth was forged into an indisputable verdict. When at last the final arguments were concluded, and the courtroom fell into a silence thick with anticipation, the judge's gavel came down, a resounding symbol of justice dispensed. In that defining moment, our $800,000 legacy was vindicated. The ruling was clear: the betrayal, executed with chilling precision, would not go unpunished. As I stepped out of that solemn building, the crisp air of afternoon imbued with the promise of renewal, I felt the crushing weight of despair begin to lift ever so slightly, replaced by a tentative glow of hope. The victorious verdict was a testament to the power of unwavering resolve, of the tireless pursuit of truth even when the shadows ran deep. The legal victory was more than a simple courtroom triumph, it was the reaffirmation of a family's honor, a restoration of trust, and the reclamation of a future that had once teetered on the brink of ruin. Yet amid the relief, the underlying scars of betrayal remained, a reminder that the journey toward healing is one marked by both bitter hardship and the luminous glow of redemption. With every newly recorded document, every detailed testimony, and every heartfelt declaration of truth, a new chapter began, a chapter where justice was not merely an abstract ideal, but a living, breathing reality. Today, in the echo of that decisive moment, I stand as both witness and guardian of a legacy that has been restored, a legacy that now shines even brighter, with the promise of renewal and the unyielding strength of a spirit that refused to be broken. As the long and winding journey of sorrow, betrayal, and ultimately redemption draws to a close, I now find myself at the threshold of reflection, a moment to gather all the fragments of truth, pain, and perseverance, and weave them into a tapestry of renewal. In these final minutes, I pause to look back on the harrowing expedition that spanned 2 arduous hours, from that first, heart-shattering instant when trust was shattered, through nights consumed by meticulous investigation, the soul-searing confrontation that laid bare hidden treachery, and finally, the diligent march toward justice in the cold halls of the courtroom. Each step of this journey has been etched into my memory like an indelible tattoo. I recall the ceaseless nights spent poring over ancient ledgers, the quiet intensity of my solitary vigils, and the painful realization that every meticulously saved cent of our cherished $800,000 college fund was more than currency. It was a beacon of our family's legacy, a sacred trust handed down from one generation to the next. As I replay those moments in my mind, the words of timeless scripture echo repeatedly, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." These words have never rung truer than they do now, offering solace, affirmation, and the promising light of eventual renewal. Through the ordeal, our family has been irrevocably changed. The wounds of betrayal cut deep, leaving scars that testify to the fragility of trust. Yet it is in these very scars that the beauty of resilience is revealed. Every tear shed in the quiet solitude of a regretful night, every moment of anguished contemplation, served as the crucible in which our collective resolve was forged anew. We learned painfully that sometimes, the most profound acts of forgiveness and renewal are born from the darkest of betrayals. This legal victory, our long-awaited vindication, was not only a triumph of evidence over deception, but an affirmation that even in the face of heart-wrenching betrayal, the spirit can rise unyielding. Now, as I stand amidst the calm after the storm, I reflect on the precious lessons that all these harrowing experiences have imparted. The journey has taught me that every moment of despair can, with faith and unyielding determination, transform into a stepping stone toward a richer future. The college fund, once a simple collection of savings, became, over time, a symbol not just of our material legacy, but of our emotional and moral fortitude. It reminds us that no matter how deep the wound, the power of truth and justice can heal even the most shattered of hearts. There is a profound beauty in the act of reclaiming what was nearly lost. Every battle fought against deceit, every legal hurdle surmounted in defense of honor, has sown the seeds of a new beginning, a future where integrity stands as the unassailable foundation of our family. Among the echoes of the past, the voice of the divine speaks clearly, "In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight." Thus, with each step forward, I carry not only the memories of former glory but also the hard-won wisdom that truth is the guiding force that illuminates our destiny. Today, as the final chapter of this long saga comes to a close, I extend an invitation to you, the listener, to reflect upon the profound testament of resilience that unfolds before you. May the experiences recounted here, though steeped in sorrow, inspire you to rise above challenges, to hold fast to your principles, and to view every setback as an opportunity for growth and renewal. The journey from betrayal to restoration is never easy, but it is a journey that cements the very essence of who we are, imbuing our lives with the strength and clarity needed to face future challenges head-on. As I draw this narration to a close, I leave you with a final thought, a hope that our story will serve as a beacon to anyone whose spirit has been tested by adversity. Let the legacy of $800,000, built on dreams, sacrifice, and honor, remind us that in every ending lies the seed of a new beginning. The path to redemption is not measured solely by legal victories or the restoration of lost funds, but by the quiet dignity with which we choose to rebuild our lives and our hearts. Thank you for walking with me through a journey of discovery, of pain, and ultimately of triumph. May every revelation inspire you, may every hardship strengthen you, and may the promise of renewal brighten your path as you, too, rise above the trials life brings. Farewell, and may the spirit of truth and righteousness forever guide your way.